Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my Anka's Talk YouTube channel. Today we have a special guest joining us to discuss about urban green spaces and trees. Peter van Bodegom. He is a leader of the Institute of Environmental Sciences at Leiden University in Netherlands. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Yeah, how was your morning?
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, how was the trip in Xiamen City?
Yes, so far so good. I enjoy the city, and what I liked a lot is seeing how green the city is. So I was very pleased to see all the different parks and all.
Your investigation area is focusing on interdependencies between society and nature in the cities, right? So can you tell me more about it?
Yeah, so what we try to show is, on the one hand, that in cities, because more and more people are living in cities, so we need to think about how we can make sure that nature survives in cities as well, given that our society is much more urban than it used to be. So that's on the one hand, how can we make sure that also in cities nature is surviving? But on the other hand, we also believe that having nature in the city can help us humans a lot. So we show, on the one hand, it's good for nature to try to protect nature in the cities, but on the other hand, it's also good for us to protect nature in the cities.
Exactly. So how many years of experience in this research area you have?
I think around 10 years.
10 years? Yeah. Why have you chosen this research area? Like, is there any special reasons you have?
For me, the important reason is that I strongly believe that we are dependent on each other, us being humans and nature on the one hand. And the other reason is that I came from ecology, and there we really focused on trying to protect nature and conserving nature. But increasingly, I believe that we should think about it in a wider context, and that we can only protect nature if we also start protecting ourselves as humans by showing that we are dependent on each other. So that's the reason why I moved into this direction.
Okay. Can you tell me more? What's the urban green spaces, and what's the difference between urban green spaces and wildlife?
Oh, that's a complicated one. So the urban green spaces to me is everything which is green in the city. So there could be a park.
It could be trees.
It could be trees along the streets. It could be a green roof on top of a building. It could even be a cemetery where there's still a lot of green and space around. So to me, green space is everything that actually has plants in a city environment. Whether and how it is different from wildlife, that's a complicated question, because we don't know yet how different urban green space is from the nature outside the city. It will be different. So definitely there will be different species in the city than out of the city. But we don't know yet how many species we would lose if we would only have green space in a city. Or if we can modify the green space in the city such that we decrease the gap between what's in the city and what's outside the city.
Okay.
But there will be a gap.
It should be a gap.
Yeah. We will lose certain species if everything would be urban green space instead of nature outside the city.
So they should have some coverage percentages in the urban area. What the percentage is approximately of the green spaces or maybe forestry in the urban area based on your experience? Of course, it depends on many factors of the particular cities, but based on your experience, what is the approximate percentage of area?
Yeah, also that I'm afraid we can't answer directly. So there's no target or something, and I would prefer not to have a target anyways, because then the target starts to live its own life. So okay, as long as we reach the target, everything is okay, and I don't believe that with a certain target, everything is okay. So to me, what is important there is making sure that your green space that you have in this city is connected to each other. Because that really helps nature to migrate from one place to the other. You need certain parts that are big to really allow, so you need a very big park or an urban forest to really make sure that the substantial part can survive. And ideally you do need connections to parts out of the city. Because in that case, organisms from inside the city can migrate to outside the city and vice versa. So I think it's really more about making sure that let's say the infrastructure of the green space is properly done, than some kind of number or percentage that we need to achieve.
Yeah, from civil engineering perspective, we have certain percentages of number in terms of the green spaces. If we plan the urban area, such amount of percentages should be. From the engineering perspective,
Yeah.
From ecology perspective, it's difficult to define.
Yeah.
You know, like it cannot be standardized, you mean?
Yeah. From an ecological perspective, I don't think we should actually standardize it, because then the engineers are thinking, okay, everything is fine as long as I do this, but they don't. Whereas I think you should think about how are things connected? What kind of green space do I want to have? How do I make sure I get a variety of green space? So I think it's much more thinking about what is nature and how do I get nature in the city than a magic number.
Okay. Of course, there are many different types of plants and trees, right, in our earth. And also, like, depends on the region's climate and the weather situation. We should choose cautiously what kind of plants or maybe trees should be suitable in our cities. So, do you have any like suggestion or like any how can I say concern that, for example, dry and semi-arid regions should have this kind of plants and trees when humid area or humid city has such kind of trees and plants?
Yeah, well, I think you should always make sure you have the native plants, being those plants that are originally growing in a certain region. That's one. On the other hand, well, in the Netherlands we have a discussion about whether we should allow non-native plants at all, because there's a competition between native plants and non-native plants, and that could lead to the extinction of native plants. So increasingly there's the concern that we should keep out non-native plants. On the other hand, with climate change, maybe we need certain plants that currently are not here yet, but will come here in the next 20 or 50 years. If you plant a tree now, most trees survive 20 to 100 years. But that also implies that ideally that trees should survive the climate of 20 or 100 years from now. So maybe we should start thinking about planting trees that are surviving in the climate which is probably coming in 20 or 50 years from now. So in that sense, I think we should try to find a good balance between native plants, because that also allows the conservation of nature, for which I think we should make sure to start with urban green space. But at the same time, make sure that those plants can truly survive in the future climate. So that's kind of, I think, the balance that we should think about when we start planting stuff.
I see. As a resident of the city, what we can contribute as citizens, because of course, like professional specialists and researchers and scientists can contribute a lot to make scientific research and study works in this area. But as a resident of the city, what could be our main contribution to enhance our ecology of the city and environment of the city?
I think so. I think there's a multiple ways. One is respecting the green space in your own city, being that you don't destroy your park, or you try to consciously deal with the plants and animals living in the city. That's one, and probably that's the most important one. Try to protect what you got in terms of green space. If you happen to have a garden as a city person, which of course I know that does not account for many, but if you have a garden, make sure you have enough green there. But if you have a balcony, you can also plant.
Yeah,
You have pots of plants or things on a balcony, flowers on your balcony. And finally, try to convince your municipality to have more green space.
To convince them, right?
Yeah.
To convince them to plant more,
Yeah.
establish more green spaces. So how can urban planners and policymakers effectively design and manage green spaces to maximize their environmental and social and health benefits while addressing potential conflicts with urban development?
Yeah. So I think on the one hand, we first should indicate why I think having green space is healthy and important. So urban green space is providing us benefits, and I think that's multiple. One, it really helps for our own mental health. So there are studies showing that people are more happy if there's green around them. It also helps for physical health. So because many people do like to run or cycle or walk in green spaces, so that's good for your body. But it also can help in a different way for our own health, because depending on the plants, they capture the fine dust in the city such that you don't breathe the fine dust. It can help to avoid that the heat island effect. So the heat island effect implies that in urban environments, it's usually or almost always warmer than outside the city because of the buildings. So the buildings absorb the heat, and therefore it's hotter in the city than outside the city. If you have a lot of plants, those plants transpire, so they release water, and the release of water leads to a cooling effect. So if you have more plants in a city, it is cooler. So that's kind of the health effect of urban nature. Then I think sort of the question is, why do city planners want to create urban space, green space? So it depends on what kind of green space you want, or why you want a certain green space, how you should, make it. So, for instance, if you want to reduce the heat island effect, as a city planner, you should first know where is the biggest heat in the city, and then plant the trees specifically there. If you are for nature conservation, then you should think about this network that I mentioned before, this infrastructure of green space, to make sure that, as many plants and animals can survive. If it's about recreation, then you should think about where do most of my people live, to have a park next to the location where most of my people live. So it actually sort of, that's where people can recreate. So it depends on why you want to do the green space.
And what's the purpose? And then,
and what's the purpose?
Yeah.
And then you make your design. And that's exactly why, in my answer to your previous question, how much percentage do we need? Well,
it depends.
It depends
on many factors.
It depends on many factors. But in one of them being, why do you want to have the green space? Is it for nature, or is it for us, or is it for both? Should we try to have both, let's say, an heat island effect reduction and nature conservation and recreation and avoiding flooding, which is another function of Greenspace, well, then we should really think about designing it properly such that we can achieve all of that.
Yeah, because I've also read several studies that emphasizes green space, especially urban forestry, can protect the city from flooding. So, do you agree with that? Because
Yeah.
yeah, right. Because green space and forestries are the natural sponge to take the humid from the atmosphere and then give it to the soil. It's like kind of a sponge, natural sponge.
Yeah, there are, I think, two ways in which urban forests can help to reduce flooding.
Mm-hmm.
The most important one is a sponge one.
Mm-hmm.
So compared to a pavement,
Yeah.
in which there's no water going in,
Oh, yeah.
a soil with plants can absorb and infiltrate the water instead of making sure that if it rains, it runs off
Run off.
and then
because of
accumulates at the lower spots and then causes flooding. So the more places you have where the water can infiltrate, the better it is.
Mm-hmm.
And urban green spaces can help there a lot. So that's the most important reason why we can avoid flooding to occur.
Mm-hmm.
The other way you can think about it, and that is increasingly done in some cities, is that you create urban green spaces at locations that are lowest in the city,
Mm-hmm.
in which you think there could be a flood here, but maybe if we can't avoid it, then let's have it happen in a green space rather than in a residential area.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, that green space can flood, avoiding damage to buildings and etc. So in that sense, you could think about creating a wetland or something that can be wet and still survive, in which you can store the water without problems. Mm-hmm. Because in the residential area, you don't want to store your water even if it's flooded. So maybe you can want to store it there. So in that sense, you can think about the green spaces in two ways for flood protection. Mm-hmm. One at locations to create a wetland where floods might occur, mm-hmm. and the other one to avoid floods to occur by having the sponge function.
I see. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about your recent studies related to urban ecology, or maybe green spaces, or maybe city forestry?
Yeah, well, we do a number of studies. So we are working hard to quantify all the benefits that we as humans may have from urban green space. Uh-huh. So we try to develop new methods to measure the fine dust collection, to measure the heat island effect. We do analysis on the infiltration, so the sponge function.
Sponge function, yeah.
We also do studies on mental health and physical health. Mm-hmm. So in all of our studies, or in many of our studies, we try to quantify some of the functions of urban green space. Mm-hmm. The other one that we are doing is partly related to one of your previous questions, which is how do we design it properly? Mm-hmm. So we create tools in which we can show to city planners, this is your heat island effect, this is your infiltration in your city, this is your flood risk in the city. Mm-hmm. This is how green space can be important for mental health and such. And we develop tools in which city planners can, see if they combine all that information, where are the locations where we should improve green space most, given that there's a big demand or need for green space in this specific area because it's not good in any of those aspects that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, by much of the information we or our understanding on how Greenspace helps for humans, and overlaying all that information, we are also developing tools for city planners to help them to optimize that.
Optimize it, yeah. So, based on your experience, because you are very experienced researcher and scientist in this area, so based on your these long years of experiences, what's the main gap in this industry, in this research area? And this question is for young researchers, because there are so many young researchers who wants to contribute to enhance the science of this area.
I think the main gap is this optimization.
Optimization of
Greenspace.
Greenspace.
Yeah, so I think for individual functions of Greenspace, including nature conservation, we increasingly know more. Although for nature conservation, there are still big questions. I think, like at the start, I think the big question to me is how many of our species could we maintain in the city if we optimally do it. But otherwise, for most of the individual functions, we are gathering more and more information, which is important and good. I think in terms of the big gap is how to optimize that and how to do that properly. Also, to make it a bit more complicated, it's not only that we do not only want all the services simultaneously, but the problem is some green spaces are better for one service than for another. So, for instance, the heat island effect is best helped by trees. But if you want to reduce fine dust, you better have grassland. So it is hard to optimize or to maximize everything together because there's different plants involved in different services. So thinking about a good balance in this optimization, that's a difficult one.
There is a big gap.
And that's the big gap. So can we, and to me that's a big question, can we actually optimize or maximize everything? And if so, how do we do that?
So let's imagine if you do that, what will happen? What will be easiest for us as a human being or maybe as a citizen person?
I think if we do that, then we create cities that are much more livable
And sustainable.
And sustainable in that way, at least sustainable from a human well-being perspective.
Well, yeah.
Sustainable and a livable city.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the ultimate aims.
Very interesting. I also would like to know about nature capital and ecosystem services, because from your profile, it's mentioned that you also address the needs of society for nature through natural capital and ecosystem services.
Yeah.
What they are about?
Well, we have been talking about ecosystem services quite a bit already, except not calling it that way.
Okay.
So the reducing the heat island effect is a service that is provided by the ecosystem, therefore called an ecosystem service, by cooling the air by transpiration. So
preventing flooding.
And preventing flooding is another ecosystem service. This providing a space for recreation is another ecosystem service. So in fact, we have been talking a lot about ecosystem services.
What about natural capital?
So a natural capital is a way to show that we should sustain biodiversity in the city to allow the nature to provide the ecosystem services. So just to give an example, not in a city but outside the city, an ecosystem service could be to provide wood.
Yeah.
Because also that's something we do need as humans. But in that case, you harvest the forest. So you remove
forest.
You remove forest. So by taking that ecosystem service, you take away natural capital. So you take away the ability to provide that service, which implies that in that case, you should think about how do I make sure to, well, renew that natural capital by regrowing the forest such that it can deliver again the wood production or the carbon sequestration. So to me, natural capital is a way to show that even if we make use of nature, we always should make sure that we sustain or renew or restore nature such that it can keep on providing the services for us humans.
Yeah, I have another very, maybe that question might be very, how can I say, naive, but I really want to ask. Because when we talk about urban green spaces and city forests, we're always thinking about like ecosystem services like heat islands, and cooling down and prevent from flooding. But what about the cities which has minus 40 degrees, which can have like minimum temperature reach minus 40? For example, Mongolia, we reach minus 35 during the winter time, and then our winter time minus degrees continues between November and March, November, December, and 5 months almost. So in this like situation, like is there any how can I say contribution like of urban green spaces and forestries during this cold period? So that the question might be very naive, but as a professional researchers, you might have give me some distinguishes.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm afraid that in winter, when everything is kind of frozen, and
no need cooling down and no flood.
So in wintertime, there's no demand for a service, for an ecosystem service, maybe. But even if there is, the plants and the animals cannot provide it because they're also shut down.
Everything is shut down.
Yeah. So in that sense, sort of for those cities, it is important to think about in the summer season, can we make sure to have urban green space that survives the winter? So again, the native plants. And to make sure that during summer, we do have a livable city.
Yeah. Is there any like studies or research projects focusing on the cold cities, green spaces?
The very cold ones, I don't know, but well, yes, there is, because also there are quite a few studies I know quite a few studies in the United States, and some cities in the inland of the United States can be quite cold in winter too, also including Canada. There are also studies done in Canada. So yes, there are those studies, but yeah, they focus mostly on summer when the plants are growing. Yeah.
Okay. My last question, can you give some advice or suggestion to young researchers who's focusing on urban ecology and green spaces?
Yeah, so we already partly dealt with that. So the big gap. From an urban ecology point of view, I think what is important to start thinking about how different is an urban habitat from outside the city. And I personally increasingly have the feeling that inside cities, ecology is working quite different from outside cities. And we may have to revisit some of our ecological concepts that have been developed in ecology over the past 100 years, if we are going to apply to urban. So my advice to young researchers in urban ecology would be ask questions whether the ecological principles are still true in an urban environment, because personally I have my doubts.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your time. So do you want to say like anything to citizens, like as a urban area people? No words?
Well, I would say enjoy the green space and value it.
Value it.
Yeah.
Correct.
Value what is there.
What is there? Yeah. So when you will departure? Today.
today.
Thank you for your time, Professor.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I really appreciate
Welcome.
for your,
Yeah.
information. You gave me a lot of information for like ordinary people and young researchers.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you for your time.
Yes.
Safe trip.